The morning light filtered through the tall windows of the Appalachian Heritage Museum in Asheville, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floors where Dr. Eleanor Whitmore stood, examining a collection of recently donated photographs. Eleanor had spent the better part of 2 decades as the museum's chief curator, dedicating her life to preserving the stories of mountain communities that had shaped the region's identity. Her work was meticulous, almost obsessive, driven by a belief that every photograph, every letter, every worn artifact held within it the whispers of lives that deserved to be remembered. The museum itself was a modest building, constructed from local stone and timber, but its archives contained treasures that rivaled institutions 10 times its size. Eleanor took pride in the fact that families from across the Appalachian region trusted her with their most precious heirlooms, knowing she would treat each item with the reverence it deserved. Among the latest donations was a leather portfolio that had arrived just 3 days earlier, sent by the estate of Margaret Thornton, a woman who had passed away at the age of 97 in a nursing home in Knoxville. The accompanying letter from Margaret's granddaughter explained that the old woman had been insistent in her final weeks that these photographs reach the museum, though she had never explained why they held such importance. Eleanor had opened the portfolio with her usual careful attention, finding inside a collection of black and white images dating from the early 1900s, most depicting scenes of rural life in the mountains. There were pictures of families standing stiffly before their cabins, children playing in creek beds, men working in timber camps, and women gathered for quilting bees. Each photograph was a window into a world that had vanished, preserved only in these fragile silver gelatin prints that Eleanor handled with cotton gloves. One photograph in particular had caught her attention that morning, and she found herself returning to it repeatedly as she worked through the collection. It showed the interior of a small church, the kind of simple wooden structure that had once dotted every hollow and ridge in the mountains. The image was dated 1908 in faded pencil on the reverse side, and someone had written beneath the date the words Pine Hollow Church, last service. The photograph captured a moment of stillness, the empty pews arranged in neat rows leading toward a simple altar, sunlight streaming through windows that no longer had glass, only wooden shutters propped open. The composition was striking in its simplicity, and Eleanor appreciated the photographer's eye for light and shadow. What made the image particularly poignant was its title, suggesting this had been the final gathering in a place that had once been the heart of a community, before the people scattered or the building fell into disrepair. Eleanor set the photograph on her examination table and adjusted the magnifying lamp, studying the details with the practiced eye of someone who had learned to read stories in the smallest elements of an image. She could see the rough-hewn quality of the wooden pews, the uneven floorboards, the handmade altar cloth that someone had embroidered with care. The walls were bare except for a simple wooden cross, and she could make out the texture of the wood planks that formed the interior walls. It was while examining the pews more closely that Eleanor noticed something she had initially overlooked. Along the backs of several pews, there appeared to be markings of some kind, too deliberate to be random scratches or wear patterns. She increased the magnification and leaned closer, her breath catching slightly as she realized these were not mere scratches, but carefully carved letters and symbols. The discovery sent a small thrill through Eleanor, the kind she always felt when an artifact revealed more than it first appeared to offer. She reached for her notebook and began to sketch what she could see, though the resolution of the photograph made it difficult to discern all the details. The carvings seemed to run along multiple pews, suggesting this was not the work of a single bored child during a long sermon, but something more systematic and intentional. Eleanor glanced at the clock and realized she had been so absorbed in the photograph that she had missed her morning meeting with the museum's education director. She carefully placed the image in an archival sleeve and locked it in her desk drawer, making a mental note to examine it more thoroughly with better equipment. As she gathered her things, Eleanor could not shake the feeling that this seemingly ordinary photograph of an abandoned church held within it a story that someone had gone to great lengths to preserve, and she was determined to uncover what those mysterious carvings might reveal about the people who had once gathered in that simple wooden building. Eleanor spent the next 2 days consumed by the photograph, returning to it during every spare moment between her regular duties at the museum. She had transferred the image to her computer using the museum's high-resolution scanner, a process that took nearly an hour to capture every detail at the maximum possible quality. With the digital file, she could zoom in far beyond what the magnifying lamp allowed, and what she discovered made her increasingly certain that the carvings on the pews were not random vandalism, but deliberate messages. The letters appeared to be names, some accompanied by dates, others followed by symbols she could not immediately identify. Eleanor began creating a spreadsheet, documenting each visible carving with its location in the photograph, attempting to transcribe the text despite the limitations of the image quality. Some names were clear enough to read with confidence, while others remained frustratingly obscure, the letters worn or the angle of the photograph making them impossible to decipher completely. What troubled Eleanor most was the context suggested by the photograph's title and date. If this truly had been the last service at Pine Hollow Church in 1908, why would someone have taken the time to carve names into the pews? And why would those carvings have been considered significant enough to photograph? Churches in rural Appalachia were typically maintained with great care by their congregations, and defacing the pews would have been seen as deeply disrespectful. Yet these carvings had clearly been made with deliberation, the letters carefully formed rather than hastily scratched. Eleanor found herself constructing theories as she worked, each more elaborate than the last. Perhaps the carvings were a memorial of some kind, a way of recording the names of congregation members before the church closed. Or perhaps they documented something darker, a tragedy that had befallen the community and needed to be remembered even as the physical place was abandoned. Eleanor decided she needed more information about Pine Hollow itself, a place name she did not recognize despite her extensive knowledge of Appalachian communities. She spent an afternoon in the museum's research library, pulling out county histories, old maps, and genealogical records. Pine Hollow did not appear on any modern maps, which was not surprising, given how many small communities had vanished over the decades as people moved away or were displaced by development projects. She finally found a reference in a 1912 county history that mentioned Pine Hollow as a settlement that had been abandoned following an outbreak of illness in 1908, with the surviving residents relocating to larger towns in the valley. The brief entry provided no details about the nature of the illness or the number of people affected, treating the community's disappearance as a minor footnote in the county's development. The connection between the church photograph and the community's abandonment seemed too significant to be coincidental, and Eleanor felt the familiar pull of a mystery that demanded investigation. She reached out to her network of fellow historians and archivists, sending carefully worded emails that described the photograph, and asked if anyone had information about Pine Hollow or similar communities that had been abandoned in that era. She also contacted the granddaughter who had donated the photographs, hoping to learn more about Margaret Thornton's connection to the images. The response came quickly, a phone call rather than an email, and the woman's voice carried a note of relief when Eleanor explained her interest. Margaret had been her grandmother's maiden name, the woman explained, but she had been born Margaret Holloway, and her family had come from somewhere in the mountains, though the exact location had been lost to time and her grandmother's reluctance to discuss her early life. Eleanor felt pieces of a puzzle beginning to align, though the picture they formed remained unclear. She asked if there were any family documents, letters, or diaries that might provide context for the photographs, and the granddaughter promised to search through the remaining boxes from her grandmother's estate. As Eleanor ended the call, she pulled up the digital image of the church once more and studied the carvings with renewed intensity. If Margaret Holloway had been born Margaret Thornton, and if her family had come from a mountain community that disappeared in 1908, then perhaps these photographs were not simply historical curiosities, but personal documents of a tragedy that had shaped her grandmother's entire life. Eleanor zoomed in on one of the clearer carvings, a name that read Sarah Thornton, followed by a date and a symbol that looked like a small cross or perhaps a flower. She added a note to her spreadsheet and continued her examination, determined to decode every visible message before pursuing the next phase of her investigation. 3 weeks after Eleanor first examined the church photograph, a package arrived at the museum containing materials that would transform her understanding of what she had discovered. Margaret Thornton's granddaughter had found a small wooden box tucked away in the back of a closet filled with letters, a diary with a cracked leather cover, and several documents that appeared to be official records from the early 1900s. Eleanor cleared her desk and spent an entire afternoon carefully examining each item, her excitement growing as she realized the significance of what she held. The diary belonged to Margaret herself, Begun in 1907 when she was just 9 years old, the entries written in a child's careful script that gradually matured. Over the pages, the early entries were mundane observations about daily life, descriptions of helping her mother with chores, playing with siblings, and attending services at what she called our little church in the hollow. The tone of the diary shifted dramatically in the spring of 1908, when Margaret began writing about people in the community falling ill with what she described as the fever that makes people forget. Her entries became increasingly distressed as she documented the progression of the illness through Pine Hollow, noting how her teacher, Miss Caroline, had been the first to show symptoms, followed by several of the older children in the school. Margaret wrote about how the adults had initially dismissed the illness as a common fever, but as more people fell sick and some began to die, panic spread through the community. What made the illness particularly terrifying, according to Margaret's account, was the way it affected people's minds before claiming their lives. Those who contracted the fever would become confused and disoriented, forgetting the names of family members, unable to recognize familiar places, losing all memory of their own identities before finally succumbing to the physical ravages of the disease. Eleanor read through the diary entries with growing horror, recognizing in Margaret's descriptions what modern medicine would likely identify as encephalitis, a brain inflammation that could indeed cause the symptoms the child had documented. In 1908, with no understanding of viral infections or effective treatments, such an outbreak in an isolated mountain community would have been devastating. Margaret's entries described how the church became a place of desperate prayer as families gathered to plead for divine intervention, and how Reverend Holloway, Margaret's father, had tried to comfort his congregation even as he watched his own community disintegrate. The diary revealed that as people died, the Reverend had begun carving their names into the church pews, a permanent record of those who had been lost, because he feared that if the illness took him as well, there would be no one left who remembered the dead or could properly mark their graves. The practice had started as a memorial, but evolved into something more urgent as the illness continued to spread. Margaret wrote about how her father spent his nights in the church, carving not just names but also brief notations about each person, their relationships, their roles in the community. He was creating a record that could survive, even if every living person's memory failed, a testament carved in wood that would outlast the fragility of human recollection. The symbols Eleanor had noticed in the photograph were revealed in the diary to be markers indicating family connections, with different designs representing parents, children, siblings, and spouses. Reverend Holloway had essentially created a genealogical record in wood, ensuring that even if the community scattered or died out completely, some trace of their existence and their connections to one another would remain. Eleanor sat back from the diary, overwhelmed by the tragedy it documented and the desperate act of preservation it revealed. The photograph she had been studying was not simply an image of an abandoned church, but a document of a community's final attempt to assert their existence against the erasure threatened by disease and death. She returned to her computer and pulled up the high-resolution scan, viewing the carved names with new understanding. Each one represented not vandalism, but an act of love and defiance, a father's determination to ensure his congregation would not be forgotten, even as an illness that destroyed memory and identity swept through their midst. Eleanor began cross-referencing the names she could read in the photograph with the entries in Margaret's diary, building a picture of the Pine Hollow community in its final months. She worked late into the evening, driven by a sense of obligation to these people who had been lost to history, determined to bring their story back into the light after more than a century of obscurity. Eleanor's investigation into Pine Hollow intensified as she worked to verify the information contained in Margaret's diary and to locate any surviving records of the community and its tragic end. She contacted the county health department's historical archives and discovered that there had indeed been an outbreak of what was described as brain fever in a mountain settlement in 1908, though the official reports were sparse and seemed designed to minimize the severity of the situation. The county had sent a doctor to investigate, but by the time he arrived, more than 30 people had died, and the remaining residents were preparing to abandon the settlement. The doctor's report, written in the detached clinical language of the era, noted that the outbreak appeared to be contained to the single community, and recommended that the church and several homes be burned to prevent the spread of infection, a recommendation that was apparently carried out shortly after the last residents departed. This revelation explained why Pine Hollow had vanished so completely from the historical record and why the church photograph was so significant. If the building had been burned shortly after the image was taken, then the photograph represented the only surviving evidence of Reverend Holloway's memorial carvings. Eleanor felt a renewed sense of urgency about her work, understanding that she was dealing with a unique historical document that preserved information that existed nowhere else. She began reaching out to genealogical societies and historical associations throughout the Appalachian region, sharing what she had learned and asking for help in identifying descendants of the Pine Hollow families. Her inquiries generated immediate interest, and within days she was receiving emails and phone calls from people who recognized names from the photograph or had family stories about relatives who had disappeared in the mountains in the early 1900s. One call in particular stood out, from a woman named Patricia Holloway, who lived in Tennessee and had been researching her family history for years. Patricia explained that her great-grandfather had been a minister in the mountains who had died young, and family legend held that he had lost most of his congregation to an epidemic, but that the details had been suppressed or forgotten. She had never been able to locate records of where he had served or what had happened to the community, and Eleanor's inquiry was the first concrete information she had encountered. The two women spent hours on the phone, with Eleanor describing the photograph and reading entries from Margaret's diary, while Patricia shared what fragments of family history had been passed down through the generations. It became clear that Patricia's great-grandfather and Margaret's father were the same person, making Patricia and the woman who had donated the photographs distant cousins who had never known of each other's existence. Eleanor proposed a collaboration that would bring together all the surviving information about Pine Hollow and create a comprehensive record of the community and the tragedy that had befallen it. Patricia agreed enthusiastically and began gathering her own family documents to contribute to the project. Meanwhile, Eleanor worked with a photography expert to create the highest possible quality reproductions of the church image, using advanced digital enhancement techniques to make the carved names and symbols as legible as possible. The expert was able to clarify many of the carvings that had been unclear in Eleanor's initial examination, revealing names and dates that filled in gaps in the community's story. With each newly deciphered carving, Eleanor added information to her growing database, cross-referencing with Margaret's diary, Patricia's family records, and the sparse official documents she had located. As the picture of Pine Hollow became clearer, Eleanor began to understand the full scope of what had been lost. The community had been home to approximately 80 people, including children, living in a remote hollow that was accessible only by a difficult mountain trail. They had been largely self-sufficient, with a school, a church, a general store, and a close-knit social structure built around extended family relationships. The outbreak had killed nearly 40% of the population over the course of 3 months, with the deaths concentrated among the very young and the very old. The survivors, traumatized and fearful that the illness might return, had scattered to different towns and cities, many of them never speaking about their origins or the tragedy they had experienced. Reverend Holloway had survived the outbreak, but had died less than a year later, his health broken by the ordeal, leaving his daughter Margaret to carry the memory of Pine Hollow into a future where no physical trace of the community remained, except for the photograph she had preserved for nearly 90 years. Eleanor decided that the story of Pine Hollow and the memorial carvings deserved to be shared with a wider audience, both as a historical record and as a testament to the resilience of communities facing unimaginable tragedy. She proposed to the museum's board of directors that they create a special exhibition centered on the church photograph, incorporating Margaret's diary, the genealogical research, and interpretive materials that would help visitors understand the context and significance of what they were seeing. The board approved the project enthusiastically, recognizing that it represented exactly the kind of work the museum existed to do, bringing forgotten stories back into public consciousness and honoring the lives of ordinary people whose experiences had shaped the region's history. Eleanor was given a budget and a timeline of 6 months to develop the exhibition, which she titled Carved in Memory, The Lost Community of Pine Hollow. The work of creating the exhibition consumed Eleanor completely as she balanced the demands of historical accuracy with the need to make the story accessible and emotionally resonant for visitors. She commissioned a large format print of the church photograph that would serve as the centerpiece of the exhibition, with interactive elements that would allow visitors to zoom in on specific carvings and learn about the individuals they commemorated. She worked with a writer to create biographical sketches of the Pine Hollow residents based on the information in Margaret's diary and the genealogical research, giving names and faces to people who had been anonymous for more than a century. Patricia Holloway became an invaluable collaborator, contributing family photographs and documents that added depth and personal detail to the exhibition narrative. As word of the project spread through Eleanor's professional network and the genealogical community, more descendants of Pine Hollow families began to come forward with their own pieces of the story. A man in North Carolina shared letters written by his great-grandmother, who had survived the outbreak as a teenager, and later recorded her memories of the community and the illness that destroyed it. A woman in Virginia contributed a quilt that had been made by the Pine Hollow Women's Circle, each square bearing the initials of the woman who had sewn it, creating another form of memorial that had survived when the physical community had not. Each new contribution enriched the exhibition and deepened Eleanor's understanding of the complex social world that had existed in that remote hollow before tragedy struck. Eleanor also worked to address the medical aspects of the story, consulting with historians of medicine to understand what the brain fever described in the historical documents might have been and how such an outbreak would have been understood and treated in 1908. The experts she consulted agreed that the symptoms described in Margaret's diary were consistent with viral encephalitis, possibly transmitted by mosquitoes in the warm months when the outbreak occurred. In the early 20th century, with no understanding of viral transmission and no effective treatments, such an outbreak would have been terrifying and inexplicable to those experiencing it. The fact that the illness affected memory and identity before causing death would have been particularly disturbing in a close-knit community where personal relationships and family connections formed the foundation of social life. Reverend Holloway's decision to carve names into the church pews took on additional poignancy when understood as a response to an illness that literally erased people's identities before taking their lives. The exhibition began to take shape in the museum's main gallery, with the large photograph of the church interior mounted on the central wall and interpretive panels arranged around it telling the story of Pine Hollow in chronological sequence. Eleanor created a timeline that began with the founding of the community in the 1870s and traced its development through the early 1900s, then documented the outbreak month by month using entries from Margaret's diary. A section of the exhibition was devoted to the memorial carvings themselves, with enlarged details from the photograph accompanied by the biographical information Eleanor had compiled about each person commemorated. Another section explored the aftermath of the tragedy, showing how the survivors had scattered and how the memory of Pine Hollow had been gradually lost until Margaret's photographs and diary brought it back to light. Eleanor included contemporary photographs of the site where the community had stood, now overgrown forest with only faint traces of old foundations visible to those who knew where to look. The opening of the Carved in Memory exhibition drew a crowd far larger than Eleanor had anticipated, filling the museum's gallery and spilling out into the hallways as people waited for their turn to view the displays. Local media had covered the story in the weeks leading up to the opening, and the combination of historical mystery, personal tragedy, and the detective work required to uncover the truth had captured public imagination. Eleanor stood near the entrance, greeting their visitors and watching their reactions as they encountered the massive photograph of the church interior and began to read the stories of the people whose names had been carved into the pews. She saw people lean close to examine the details of the carvings, heard whispered conversations as family groups discussed what they were learning, and noticed more than a few visitors wiping away tears as they absorbed the full weight of the tragedy that had befallen Pine Hollow. What moved Eleanor most deeply were the descendants who had traveled from across the region and beyond to attend the opening, many of them meeting for the first time despite their shared ancestry. Patricia Holloway had organized a gathering in the museum's conference room following the official opening, bringing together more than 30 people who could trace their lineage back to Pine Hollow families. Eleanor joined them and listened as they shared family stories, compared old photographs, and marveled at the connections they were discovering. Several people had brought documents and artifacts they had inherited without fully understanding their significance. and the gathering became an impromptu research session as people worked together to place these items in context. A woman produced a small wooden cross that her grandmother had always kept on her dresser, and Patricia recognized it as matching the description in family letters of crosses that Reverend Holloway had carved for each family in his congregation. Another descendant shared a Bible with names and dates written on the flyleaf, and Eleanor realized these were some of the same names visible in the church photograph, creating yet another connection between the scattered pieces of evidence. The exhibition remained open for 3 months and became the most visited show in the museum's history, drawing more than 15,000 people through its doors. Eleanor gave dozens of tours and lectures, each time finding new aspects of the story to emphasize or new questions from visitors that pushed her thinking in unexpected directions. School groups came to learn about how historians piece together evidence from fragmentary sources, and Eleanor developed educational materials that used the Pine Hollow investigation as a case study in historical research methods, genealogists, and family. Historians came to study the techniques she had used to identify and connect the descendants, and several academic journals published articles about the project and its implications for understanding rural Appalachian history. The photograph itself became iconic, reproduced in textbooks and historical publications as an example of how seemingly ordinary images can contain extraordinary stories when examined with care and context. What surprised Eleanor was the emotional impact the exhibition had on visitors who had no personal connection to Pine Hollow or the families involved. People wrote in the visitor comment book about how the story had moved them to think differently about their own communities and the importance of preserving memory and honoring those who came before. Teachers wrote about students who had been inspired to research their own family histories or to document the stories of elderly relatives before those memories were lost. The exhibition seemed to tap into something universal about the human need to be remembered and the fear of being forgotten, themes that resonated across time and culture. Eleanor realized that while she had begun this project as a historical investigation, it had evolved into something more profound, a meditation on memory, loss, and the ways communities preserve their identities in the face of tragedy. As the exhibition's run drew to a close, Eleanor worked with the museum's board to plan for its legacy. The physical displays would be dismantled, but the research materials and the connections forged between descendants would continue. Eleanor proposed creating a digital archive that would make all the documentation available online, allowing people to explore the story of Pine Hollow and contribute their own family information to the growing database. She also suggested establishing an annual gathering for Pine Hollow descendants and anyone interested in the community's history, creating an ongoing memorial that would keep the story alive for future generations. The board approved both proposals, and Eleanor began the work of transitioning from exhibition curator to archive builder, ensuring that the memory of Pine Hollow would be preserved not just in a museum display, but in a living, growing collection of stories and connections that would continue to evolve. In the months following the exhibition's closing, Eleanor found herself reflecting on how the project had changed her understanding of her work as a historian and curator. She had always believed in the importance of preserving the past, but the Pine Hollow investigation had shown her how historical research could have immediate and profound effects on living people. The descendants who had connected through the exhibition maintained regular contact, forming a community bound not by geography, but by shared ancestry and the collective work of remembering. Patricia Holloway had taken on the role of organizing this network, creating a newsletter and a social media group where people shared family stories, photographs, and documents. Eleanor contributed regularly to these efforts, helping to verify information and place new discoveries in historical context. The digital archive Eleanor had proposed became a reality through a grant from a regional foundation interested in Appalachian history and genealogy. Working with a team of digital specialists, Eleanor created a comprehensive online resource that included high-resolution images of the church photograph with interactive annotations, transcriptions of Margaret's diary and other primary sources, biographical profiles of Pine Hollow residents, and a family tree that showed the complex web of relationships within the community. The archive also included a section where descendants and other researchers could contribute their own materials, making it a collaborative and ever-expanding resource. Within 6 months of its launch, The archive had attracted thousands of visitors and had grown to include materials related to other lost Appalachian communities, becoming a model for how digital tools could be used to preserve and share local history. Eleanor also found herself thinking about the broader implications of what the Pine Hollow carvings represented. In an age before widespread literacy, before photography was common in rural areas, before official record-keeping reached into remote mountain communities, Reverend Holloway had created a memorial that could survive the destruction of the physical community and the death or dispersal of everyone who had known the people commemorated. His act of carving names into wood had been both practical and symbolic, a way of asserting that these lives had meaning and deserved to be remembered, even when every other trace of them might vanish. Eleanor began to research other examples of vernacular memorials, the ways ordinary people throughout history had created records and monuments using whatever materials and methods were available to them. She discovered carved names on prison walls, scratched initials on window panes, messages written in the margins of books, all of them attempts to leave a mark that would outlast the individual life. This research led Eleanor to propose a new exhibition that would explore the theme of vernacular memory across different contexts and time periods. She wanted to show how people who lacked access to formal memorialization, whether because of poverty, social marginalization, or catastrophic circumstances, had nonetheless found ways to assert their existence and preserve their stories. The Pine Hollow carvings would be one example among many, connected to a broader human impulse to resist erasure and to claim a place in the historical record. The museum board was enthusiastic about the concept, seeing it as a natural extension of the work Eleanor had done with the Pine Hollow exhibition and an opportunity to explore themes that were both historically significant and deeply relevant to contemporary concerns about whose stories get told and preserved. As Eleanor developed this new project, she remained in close contact with the Pine Hollow descendants and continued to receive occasional inquiries from people who had seen the exhibition or encountered the story through media coverage. One such inquiry came from a filmmaker who wanted to create a documentary about the community and the process of uncovering its history. Eleanor was initially hesitant, concerned about sensationalizing the tragedy or exploiting the descendants' grief, but after meeting with the filmmaker and discussing his vision for the project, she agreed to participate. The resulting documentary would take 2 years to complete and would ultimately bring the Pine Hollow story to a national audience, introducing millions of people to the small mountain community and the memorial carved into its church pews. Eleanor served as the historical consultant for the film, ensuring accuracy while also helping to shape a narrative that honored both the tragedy of what had been lost and the resilience of those who had survived and carried the memory forward. The documentary about Pine Hollow premiered at a regional film festival and received immediate acclaim for its sensitive handling of the subject matter and its exploration of how communities process and preserve traumatic memories. Eleanor attended the premiere with Patricia Holloway and several other descendants, watching as the story she had spent years researching unfolded on screen for an audience that gasped and wept at the appropriate moments. The filmmaker had structured the documentary as a parallel narrative, interweaving the historical story of the 1908 outbreak with the contemporary story of Eleanor's investigation and the descendants' journey to reclaim their family history. The effect was powerful, showing how the past and present were connected through the act of remembering and how historical research could be a form of healing and restoration. Following the festival premiere, the documentary was picked up by a streaming service and released to a wide audience. Eleanor found herself fielding interview requests from journalists and podcasters who wanted to discuss the Pine Hollow story and the broader themes it raised about memory, community, and historical preservation. She was careful in these interviews to emphasize that Pine Hollow was not unique, that there were countless other communities whose stories had been lost or forgotten, and that the work of recovering and preserving these histories was ongoing and urgent. She used the platform the documentary provided to advocate for increased funding for local historical societies and archives, arguing that these institutions were the guardians of stories that would otherwise vanish completely. The attention generated by the documentary also brought new information to light as people who had seen the film reached out with their own connections to Pine Hollow or similar communities. Eleanor received a letter from a woman in Kentucky who had inherited a photograph album that included an image of Pine Hollow Church taken from the outside, showing the building in its full context on a hillside surrounded by trees. This exterior photograph, when combined with the interior image Eleanor had been working with, provided a more complete picture of the physical space and helped researchers better understand the community's geography. Another person contributed a map drawn by a timber surveyor in 1907 that showed the locations of homes and other buildings in Pine Hollow, allowing Eleanor to create a detailed reconstruction of the community's layout. These new discoveries led Eleanor to organize a field expedition to the site where Pine Hollow had stood, bringing together descendants, historians, and archaeologists to document what physical traces might still remain. The group hiked into the remote hollow on a clear autumn day, following old trails that had been overgrown for decades. At the site, they found the foundations of several buildings, including what appeared to be the church, now just a rectangular outline of stacked stones slowly being reclaimed by the forest. The archaeologists conducted a preliminary survey and collected artifacts, including fragments of pottery, glass, and metal that would be analyzed and added to the growing archive of Pine Hollow materials. For the descendants who had made the journey, standing on the ground where their ancestors had lived and died was an emotional experience, making the historical narrative they had learned feel immediate and real. Eleanor documented the expedition carefully, taking photographs and notes that would become part of the archive and potentially inform future research or educational programs. She was struck by how the physical landscape had changed. The cleared fields and pastures now returned to forest, the roads and paths disappeared, the human presence erased except for these subtle traces that required trained eyes to recognize. Yet the memory of the community persisted, carried forward by the photograph, the diary, the carvings, and now by the network of descendants and researchers who had committed themselves to ensuring Pine Hollow would not be forgotten. As the group prepared to leave the site, Patricia Holloway suggested they hold a brief memorial service, and Reverend Holloway's great-great-granddaughter, who had become a minister like her ancestor, led them in prayers and readings that honored those who had lived and died in this place. Eleanor stood with the group, feeling the weight of history and the power of collective memory, understanding that her work had helped create something that transcended academic research and touched on fundamental human needs for connection, remembrance, and meaning. 2 years after Eleanor first examined the photograph of Pine Hollow Church, the museum hosted a symposium bringing together historians, genealogists, public health experts, and community members to discuss the lessons and implications of the Pine Hollow story. Eleanor had organized the event as a way of reflecting on what had been learned and considering how the methods and approaches used in this investigation might be applied to other historical mysteries and forgotten communities. The symposium attracted participants from across the country, including several prominent scholars who had followed the Pine Hollow project and seen in it a model for community-engaged historical research. Over 2 days of presentations and discussions, participants explored topics ranging from the history of infectious disease in rural America to the ethics of historical research involving traumatic events to the role of digital technology in democratizing access to historical materials. Eleanor presented on the final panel, reflecting on her journey from that first moment of noticing the carvings in the photograph to the complex web of research, relationships, and public engagement that had followed. She spoke about the importance of taking time to really look at historical materials, to notice the details that might seem insignificant at first glance, but that could open up entire worlds of understanding. She emphasized that historical research was not just about recovering facts, but about honoring the humanity of people who had lived in different times and circumstances, treating their experiences with respect and empathy. She also acknowledged the collaborative nature of the work, noting that the Pine Hollow story had only been fully recovered through the contributions of many people, each bringing their own knowledge, materials, and perspectives to the collective effort. The symposium concluded with the announcement of a new initiative that Eleanor had been working on with several partner institutions. The Pine Hollow project would expand beyond the single community to create a regional network focused on identifying and documenting other lost or forgotten communities throughout Appalachia. The project would provide training and resources for local historians and genealogists, create standards and best practices for community history research, and build a comprehensive digital infrastructure for sharing and preserving the materials collected. Eleanor would serve as the director of the project, working with a team of researchers and community partners to ensure that the lessons learned from Pine Hollow could benefit efforts to recover other hidden histories. The announcement was met with enthusiasm, and several people immediately volunteered to participate or suggested communities that deserved investigation. In the months that followed the symposium, Eleanor began the work of building the infrastructure for the expanded project while continuing to maintain and develop the Pine Hollow archive. She hired a small staff, secured additional funding from foundations and government agencies, and established partnerships with universities and historical societies across the region. The project quickly gained momentum, with research teams beginning work on several communities that had been identified as priorities. Each investigation followed the model established with Pine Hollow, combining archival research with community engagement and using digital tools to make the findings widely accessible. Eleanor found herself in the role of mentor and coordinator, helping research teams navigate challenges and sharing the insights she had gained from her own experience. The Pine Hollow descendants remained actively involved in the broader project, serving as advisors and advocates, and sharing their experience of how historical research had affected their understanding of their own identities and family histories. Patricia Holloway became a particularly effective spokesperson, speaking at conferences and community events about the power of recovering lost stories and the importance of preserving local history. She often brought the wooden cross that had been identified during the exhibition opening, using it as a tangible connection to the past and a reminder of why this work mattered. Eleanor watched with satisfaction as the network of people engaged with the project grew, creating a community of practice around the work of historical recovery and preservation that extended far beyond what she had imagined when she first noticed those mysterious carvings in an old photograph. 5 years after discovering the Pine Hollow photograph, Eleanor stood in her office at the museum, now expanded to accommodate the growing staff and resources of the Regional History Project. The walls were covered with maps, photographs, and timelines documenting not just Pine Hollow but a dozen other communities whose stories had been recovered through the work she had initiated. Each community had its own unique history and its own tragedy or transformation that had led to its disappearance from the historical record, and each recovery had brought together descendants, researchers, and community members in the collaborative work of remembering. Eleanor felt a deep sense of accomplishment when she looked at these materials, knowing that hundreds of people who had been forgotten were now remembered, their names and stories preserved and honored. The project had grown beyond anything she had imagined that morning when she first noticed the mysterious carvings in an old photograph, evolving into a movement that was changing how people throughout the region thought about history, memory, and community identity. The original Pine Hollow photograph still held a place of honor in Eleanor's office, a reminder of where this journey had begun. She had learned to read every detail of that image, could identify each visible carving, and tell the story of the person it commemorated. But she also understood now that the photograph's significance extended beyond the specific information it contained. It represented a moment when someone, likely one of the last residents of Pine Hollow, had recognized the importance of documenting what was about to be lost and had taken the time to create a careful record. That act of preservation across more than a century had made everything that followed possible, and Eleanor felt a sense of kinship with that unknown photographer who had shared her commitment to ensuring that the past would not be entirely erased. She often wondered about that photographer, whether they had understood the full significance of what they were documenting or had simply felt compelled to capture the image before the building was destroyed. Eleanor had recently received word that Margaret Thornton's diary and the church photograph would be featured in a major exhibition at the Smithsonian Institution, part of a larger show about American communities and the ways people create and preserve collective memory. She had been invited to serve as a consultant for the exhibition and to contribute an essay to the accompanying catalogue. The recognition was gratifying, but what mattered more to Eleanor was knowing that millions of people would encounter the Pine Hollow story and might be inspired to look more carefully at their own family histories, their own communities, and the historical materials that surrounded them in attics and archives. She hoped that some of those visitors would notice details that others had overlooked, would ask questions that led to new discoveries, would take up the work of recovering and preserving stories that deserved to be told. The ripple effects of historical research were impossible to predict, but Eleanor had seen enough examples over the past 5 years to believe that sharing the Pine Hollow story widely would generate new investigations and new recoveries of forgotten histories. The Pine Hollow descendants had established an annual gathering that took place each autumn, rotating between different locations, but always including a visit to the site where the community had stood. Eleanor attended whenever possible, valuing the opportunity to reconnect with people who had become friends, as well as research collaborators. At the most recent gathering, the group had dedicated a memorial marker at the site, a simple stone bearing the names of those who had died in the 1908 outbreak and a brief text explaining the history of the community. The marker had been designed to withstand the elements and to remain legible for generations, a permanent testament to lives that had nearly been forgotten. Standing at the dedication ceremony, Eleanor had thought about Reverend Holloway carving names into church pews by lamplight, driven by the same impulse to create a record that would outlast individual memory and physical structures. The ceremony had been deeply moving, with descendants reading the names of their ancestors aloud and sharing stories that had been passed down through families or recovered through the research project. What struck Eleanor most powerfully during that gathering was the presence of children and teenagers among the descendants, young people who were learning about Pine Hollow and taking ownership of the story as part of their own heritage. Several of the teenagers had become involved in the research project, helping to digitize documents, conduct oral history interviews with elderly relatives, and create educational materials for their schools. One young woman had written her college application essay about discovering her connection to Pine Hollow and how it had changed her understanding of her family and herself. Another had created a website dedicated to one of the families from the community, gathering photographs and documents and building a comprehensive genealogy that extended from the 1800s to the present day. Eleanor saw in these young people the future of the work she had begun, a new generation, committed to preserving memory and honoring the past. Eleanor's work continued to evolve as new technologies and methodologies emerged, offering fresh possibilities for historical research and public engagement. She had recently begun experimenting with virtual reality, creating immersive experiences that would allow people to virtually walk through reconstructed historical communities and encounter the people who had lived there through interactive narratives based on historical records. The first such project was naturally a reconstruction of Pine Hollow as it had existed in 1907, before the outbreak that destroyed it. Eleanor worked with descendants to ensure accuracy and sensitivity, using the maps, photographs, and written descriptions to create a detailed digital environment. The experience would include the church with its carved pews, allowing visitors to examine each carving up close and learn about the person it commemorated. It would be a new form of memorial, using cutting-edge technology to preserve and share a story that had begun with the most basic of tools, a knife and a piece of wood, and a determination to resist forgetting. As Eleanor tested the virtual environment, walking through the digital church and reading the names carved into the pews, she felt the past and present converge in a way that was both disorienting and profound. The virtual church looked exactly as it had in the photograph, but now she could move through the space, could see the carvings from different angles, could understand the physical context in ways the single photograph had not allowed. The development team had used artificial intelligence to enhance the legibility of the carvings, making it possible to read names and dates that had been too worn or poorly lit to decipher in the original image. Each carving was linked to a database entry that provided biographical information, family connections, and in some cases photographs of the individuals commemorated. Visitors to the virtual environment could spend hours exploring, learning about the community, one person at a time, building a rich understanding of the social world that had existed in that remote hollow. The virtual Pine Hollow project generated significant media attention when it was announced, with technology publications praising the innovative use of virtual reality for historical preservation and education. Eleanor gave numerous interviews explaining the project and its goals, always emphasizing that the technology was a means to an end, a tool for making history accessible and engaging rather than an end in itself. She was careful to note that the virtual environment was based on extensive research and consultation with descendants, that it represented the best available understanding of what Pine Hollow had been like but was not a perfect recreation. The goal was to create an experience that would help people connect emotionally and intellectually with the past, to understand that history was not just dates and facts, but the lived experiences of real people who had loved and worked and suffered and hoped, just as people do today. The success of the Pine Hollow virtual reality project led to requests from other communities and historical organizations interested in creating similar experiences. Eleanor found herself in the unexpected role of technology advocate, helping historians and curators understand how digital tools could enhance their work and reach new audiences. She organized workshops and training sessions, wrote articles for professional journals, and served on advisory boards for digital humanities projects. Throughout all of this activity, she remained grounded in the fundamental principles that had guided her work from the beginning: respect for the people whose stories were being told, commitment to accuracy and evidence-based research, and belief in the power of history to connect people across time and create meaning in the present. On quiet evenings, Eleanor would sometimes return to her office after the museum had closed and sit with the Pine Hollow photograph, reflecting on the journey it had taken her on and the lives it had touched. She thought about Margaret Thornton, who had preserved the photograph for 90 years before finally sending it to the museum, carrying the weight of her community's tragedy throughout her long life. She thought about Reverend Holloway, working by lamplight to carve names into wood, creating a memorial that would survive fire and abandonment and the passage of more than a century. She thought about all the descendants who had come forward to share their stories and documents, contributing to the collective work of remembering. And she thought about the visitors to the exhibition and the documentary viewers and the students who had learned about Pine Hollow in their classrooms, all of them touched in some way by this story of loss and memory and the human need to be remembered. Eleanor had come to understand that her work was not really about the past at all, or at least not only about the past. It was about the present and the future, about helping people understand where they came from and how they were connected to larger stories and communities. It was about asserting that every life has value and deserves to be remembered, that the experiences of ordinary people in small communities matter just as much as the deeds of famous individuals in grand settings. It was about creating tools and resources that would allow future generations to continue the work of recovery and preservation, ensuring that fewer stories would be lost and more voices would be heard. The Pine Hollow photograph had been a beginning, a doorway into a world that had been hidden, and Eleanor had walked through that doorway and found not just a historical mystery to solve, but a calling that would shape the rest of her life and touch countless others in ways she was still discovering.